All right, so today was interesting. Yesterday, let's set the stage here. Washington football team, now the Washington Commanders, and I'm going to call them the Washington Commanders in the context of this investigation because they don't get to whitewash their brand by changing the name of the team. New name, same team. It's the Washington Commanders workplace misconduct investigation as far as I'm concerned. There was a roundtable hearing yesterday before Congress where multiple former members of the team showed up and told stories about things that they encountered during their time working there. There was some back and forth yesterday about Tiffany Johnston's claims of misconduct by Daniel Snyder, and he denied it, and that went back and forth, and it turns out the NFL says these are new allegations because she didn't cooperate with the Beth Wilkinson investigation. And I thought, well, that's odd. Why would she not cooperate with the Beth Wilkinson investigation? So based on some things we learned today, I wonder why anyone cooperated with the Beth Wilkinson investigation. The committee that's investigating this situation released some documents, and I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible. And Miles, I'm serious. Ask me questions if you want to help flesh this out. Big Cat does that all the time. Sims does that all the time because this is esoteric lawyer stuff. What happens from time to time is that if you've got two different parties that are in the same pot of trouble, you will get what's called, it's usually called a joint defense agreement. They called it a common interest agreement between the NFL and the Washington Commanders. What it means is, look, we have a mess here. Our interests are aligned. We'd like to create a situation where we can communicate among each other without jeopardizing the attorney-client privilege. The attorney-client privilege is a very simple concept. Anything you say to your lawyer says to you for the purposes of receiving, developing, getting, using legal advice is protected. It can never be disclosed. It can never be discussed. It can never be invaded. But if you talk to somebody else about what your lawyer told you, it becomes fair game. So there's nothing that Daniel Snyder could have said to Roger Goodell without jeopardizing the attorney-client privilege between him and Beth Wilkinson without this agreement. They needed this agreement so they can share information and protect the privilege. That's the basic fact. But what it means, especially when you consider the engagement letter that was sent by Beth Wilkinson's firm to the Washington Commanders when she was first hired, and you read the language of it. And again, I'm trying to keep this as understandable as possible. Bottom line is this. The investigation was far different than what we were led to believe it is. This was not a Deflategate investigation. This was not a Bountygate investigation. This was not a Richie Incognito Bullygate investigation where someone was going to do the investigation and create a report that was going to be made available publicly to let everyone know what happened and what they were going to do about it. That's not what this was. This was an effort to circle the wagons and investigate these claims for the purposes of best defending against any lawsuits that would be filed. And Miles, the next step for me is to find out what these individuals were told when they were recruited to tell their stories. Because if someone comes to you and says, we understand you worked for a company that had a toxic workplace for the last 10 years. We are investigating everything that happened so that we can properly determine what occurred. We can make sure it never happens again, and we can hold all people accountable. Will you cooperate? That's one way to put it. And if I hear it that way, I say, yeah, okay, I'll cooperate. If they come to you and say, we've been hired by your former employer because there's been some problems at work for the last 10 years, and we think we may get sued. We think we may be sued by you. We'd like for you to tell us your story so we can properly plan to defend ourselves against any and all lawsuits, including the one you may file someday. If you tell me that, I'm hanging up the phone. I'm slamming the door. I'm politely inviting you to get the F out of my house. And I get the impression that they may have led the folks to believe, I know they led us to believe, that it was the first thing. The truth is, it was the second thing. And I was disappointed the way this was all presented today and the way it was reported. It really didn't hammer that point home. This is the most glaring example, and this isn't hyperbole. This is the most glaring example of league office chicanery that I have encountered in 20-plus years of covering the NFL. They lied and misrepresented grossly what this was in comparison to what it is. This is a we must protect the golden goose and all of its eggs exercise. This isn't we must get to the truth in order to prevent these things from happening again and create the kind of transparency that we've given you, when we want to give you transparency. When we're not worried about getting sued, we'll give you all the transparency you want. When we're worried about getting sued, we're going to act like we're in it for transparency, but we're not. Which makes the excuse they've given us the BS excuse. We're just trying to protect the people who requested anonymity, so we're not giving you anything. They're using those people as human shields. That's a lie. That is a flat-out falsehood. It's a flat-out deception. They don't care about those people. They care about themselves. They're using those people so they don't have to tell us the truth, because the truth doesn't sound very good.
Right. Well, and to your point about, how the second thing, if somebody's coming in and saying, well, we need to know this information so that if you were to sue us, then we can be better prepared for it. So Deborah Katz, who's a lawyer who represents more than 40 women who were a part of this Washington investigation, tweeted today that not a single witness, not one, which is her emphasis, would have participated in the Wilkinson investigation had they been told the truth about the NFL and Washington's joint defense agreement. This reeks. So, given that information, it appears that the women who came forward in the investigation were misled about the true intentions of this investigation, which, and you put it this way earlier, Mike, in one of your posts at PFT, that the real reason that they did this was not to get to the truth and get accountability. It was to get to the truth and then bury it.
Yeah, that's right. She wasn't a finder. She was a fixer. She was hired to, and that makes it necessarily not an independent investigation. It's an investigation conducted by someone who ultimately is representing our interests by crafting the investigation. And look, it's very simple. Just think about all the issues that have come up about the Brian Flores case, all the factual twists and turns, the different ways that we can perceive reality. We talked about this yesterday. You can have three different people witness the exact same incident and have three different stories and all testify truthfully as to what they saw. So the lawyer who performs the investigation and crafts the final report, or not a final report as the case may be, has a lot of power. And I think they ultimately didn't create a final report because they knew it was so bad they never wanted any of it to be reduced to writing. They never wanted a single word to be put on paper as to what Beth Wilkinson believed had happened and what Beth Wilkinson believed should happen. Remember when 106.7 The Fan in D.C., the sports junkies, reported that they had secured a draft of Beth Wilkinson's recommendations and findings? Remember that while the investigation was happening? Someone told me at the time, and I think this was speculation, but boy, it makes a ton of sense. This was Wilkinson's way of kind of assuaging guilt, cleaning her soul. This is her way of getting the word out as to what went on, because she knew it was all going to get buried. Again, I think no one's saying that that's what happened, but somebody from her firm or Wilkinson herself knew which way the wind was blowing here, and it was blowing all under the rug. And everything that she found, now countering that is the fact that she knew damn well going in what the game was. She knew she wasn't being hired to do an independent investigation that was going to be disclosed to everyone like Deflategate was. This was never going to be disclosed. That's the thing that people need to understand about today's developments. The documents that were released today mean this stuff was never going to be shared publicly. This was about finding out what happened, using it to best position yourself to defend against any litigation, and otherwise burying it from view. They were never going to have transparency here. And I hope people figure that out, and I hope more people say that this is BS and it needs to be changed. And I hope Shireen's going to attend the commissioner's press conference next Wednesday. I'm going to make sure she's loaded up. My gut's her blood. I'm going to make sure she's loaded up with questions about this, because these questions need to be asked.
Well, yes. So, and you bring up questions. So this is one that I have. This agreement that was between the NFL and Washington, is that sort of analogous to something like spousal privilege? because that's kind of the way I'm thinking of it, where it's like, you have these two and you can't get one of them to sort of testify against the other because of the information that gets shared between them.
What happens is it pulls multiple parties into the bubble that is protected by the attorney-client privilege. Without this agreement, you can't have communications between Roger Goodell and Dan Snyder about the things that Beth Wilkinson may or may not be finding. For example, and this is pure speculation, but if Dan Snyder were to have a conversation with Beth Wilkinson in the absence of a joint defense agreement, and Beth Wilkinson were to say, hey, Dan, you guys are screwed, and Dan were to pick up the text and text Roger, dear Roger, Beth says we're screwed. Without a defense agreement, joint defense agreement, that's fair game. The communication from Snyder to Goodell,
right.
Beth Wilkinson says we're screwed, fair game. With a joint defense agreement, that communication falls within the privilege. So it's kind of like having, it's like having multiple members of the family represented by the same lawyer. You can have these conversations among yourselves to figure out what we're going to do. It makes sure that it's all buttoned up to make sure everyone's on the same page so that none of those communications that happen can ever be invaded by a lawsuit. And you only have that. See, this is what pisses me off too. They're using the attorney-client privilege and the work product doctrine, which is basically a rule that says anything that the lawyer thinks of, any ideas, suggestions, recommendations, conclusions, those are all protected because you're trying to invade the mind of the lawyer as these things are reduced to writing. Those are put in place in anticipation of a lawsuit. They're using these to keep information from Congress, even though there's been no lawsuit filed. And I'd like to think that most statutes of limitations have already passed. I don't know why these people aren't suing. I don't know. Maybe some of the cases can still be filed. But one of the questions that was raised yesterday by one of the Congress people who would like this stuff to all be, put on the back burner so we can have hearings about the border crisis. But one of the things that was said that actually makes sense, why isn't there a lawsuit? That's what's amazing to me, because that's a way to force all this stuff out into the open.
So that kind of leads to my next question is, what can Congress do now that we have had this hearing and the NFL says that it's turned over documents that it can turn over, but these things that are protected, they're going to keep private?
Well, what Congress can do is eventually have a public hearing where Beth Wilkinson is required to testify, Roger Goodell is required to testify, Daniel Snyder is required to testify, and others testify, like they did in October of 2009 when they brought Roger Goodell and DeMaurice Smith to Congress for an open hearing on the NFL's abysmal record of dealing with head trauma and protecting players from head trauma and telling players about the long-term risks of head trauma. That's the thing that this may be pointing toward. And there's the possibility of legislation that would apply to all employees and all employers about how to deal with these things. But that's where this is heading potentially. And I hope it does. It may be our only way to begin to even scratch the surface of the truth. When we return, breaking down the Super Bowl matchup with a game of take your pick. We'll do that next on this Friday edition of PFTPM.
Hi, I'm Mike Tirico, and thanks for watching. Make sure to hit subscribe for the latest news and highlights from NBC Sports.